Before we dive into this unforgettable story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how this story unfolds. Have you ever been in a situation where someone looked at you and made you feel like you didn't belong? Have you ever felt that sting when someone judged you based on the way you looked or where you were from? It's not a nice feeling, is it? Well, this story is about a couple, Maya and Tyrone. They were like any other couple, just living their lives. But little did the world around them know, they were about to change the life of someone in the most surprising way. It all started on a regular flight from New York to Los Angeles. Maya and Tyrone were just like the other passengers, just trying to relax after a busy week. They had been looking forward to this flight. After a long week of work and hustle, all they wanted to do was sit back, enjoy the ride, and maybe even get some rest. They found their seats by the window, the perfect spot to relax. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, giving out snacks and drinks. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the cabin, making Maya's mouth water. She loved the smell of coffee on flights. It felt comforting, like a little piece of home. The cabin was full of soft chatter. People were talking quietly, laughing, and chatting about their plans for the weekend. The hum of the plane's engines created a steady, almost soothing sound. The kind of sound that could make you fall asleep if you weren't careful. It felt peaceful, like the world outside the plane didn't even matter. But there was something strange. Something wasn't quite right. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Maya felt a small knot in her stomach. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, but she had a feeling that something was going to happen. Something unexpected. She looked at Tyrone, her boyfriend, sitting next to her. He was already leaning back in his seat, eyes closed, enjoying the peacefulness of the flight. He didn't feel it, but Maya couldn't shake the feeling. There was a subtle tension in the air. As the passengers settled in, a soft voice came over the intercom, announcing that the plane would be cruising at altitude soon. The plane had leveled out, and the seatbelt sign went off. People were allowed to move around now, but no one seemed to be in a rush. They were all just relaxing. And then it happened. Maya had just pulled out her book, ready to dive into the next chapter, when she felt someone standing near their row. It was a flight attendant, Sarah. Sarah had already walked past them once before, but this time, she stopped right next to their seats. Maya looked up at her, expecting a simple, "Can I get you anything?" like she had heard on other flights. But that wasn't what she got. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said in a voice that wasn't quite polite but wasn't rude either. It was cold, like she was in a hurry and just wanted to get her job done. "Could you move your bag? It's in the way." Tyrone, who had been resting his head against the window, opened his eyes and looked at Sarah. He blinked a few times, clearly surprised. "Sure, no problem," he said, as he reached down to move his bag under the seat in front of him. He didn't want to make a fuss, but Sarah didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him. It was odd. Most flight attendants would have just moved on after getting a quick response, but not Sarah. She was still standing there, as if she was waiting for something. "Thank you," Tyrone said, finally shifting in his seat. He was trying to be polite, but the way Sarah was looking at him made him uncomfortable. But then something even stranger happened. Sarah turned her attention to Maya. "Ma'am, I need you to store that bag properly," Sarah said. Her tone was sharp, almost commanding. It was clear from the way she spoke that she didn't expect Maya to argue. Maya blinked, confused. She looked at her bag, which was resting next to her feet. It wasn't in anyone's way, and it certainly wasn't blocking anything. "I thought it was fine there," Maya said softly, trying to keep her voice calm. But Sarah didn't seem to care. She stared at the bag, her eyes narrowing. "I need you to put it under the seat," she repeated, her voice getting louder. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She didn't understand what was happening. Why was Sarah treating her like this? She looked around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed, but no one seemed to be paying attention. "Okay," Maya said, trying to stay calm. She grabbed her bag and slipped it under the seat in front of her. But the way Sarah was looking at her, judging her, made Maya feel uncomfortable. It was as if she was being treated differently for no reason. Tyrone glanced at Maya and then at Sarah. His expression hardened. He didn't like what was happening, but he didn't want to make things worse. He squeezed Maya's hand and gave her a small nod. She smiled at him, but it was a tight, forced smile. She could feel the tension building inside her. Sarah didn't say another word. She turned and walked away, but not before giving one last look back at them. It was a look that said she had already decided who they were, without even bothering to get to know them. As the flight continued, Maya couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Why had Sarah treated her like that? It wasn't just about the bag. It was the way Sarah had spoken to her. Like she was nothing. Maya had dealt with rude people before, but something about this felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had judged them based on how they looked. Maybe it was because they were a black couple flying first class. Maybe it was because of something else. But Maya wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. What do you think that was about? Maya asked Tyrone, her voice barely a whisper. Tyrone shook his head, not sure what to say. I don't know, he replied. But it didn't feel right, did it? No, Maya said, her voice firm now. It didn't. The rest of the flight felt different. Every time Sarah passed by their row, she seemed to take extra care to avoid looking at them. It was as if she didn't want to acknowledge their presence at all. Maya and Tyrone exchanged looks, both wondering what to do. They didn't want to make a scene. They didn't want to cause trouble. But they also didn't want to let this slide. Tyrone sat up straighter in his seat, his eyes scanning the cabin. Maya was still lost in thought, trying to make sense of the whole situation. Was this really about the bag? Or was it something more? Maya and Tyrone both knew that something had shifted in the air. It wasn't just the turbulence or the noise of the plane. Something had happened that changed the way they were treated. And it wasn't over yet. The tension in the cabin seemed to grow with each passing minute. Maya could feel it. She knew that Sarah's judgment wasn't going to be the last of it. It was only a matter of time before things would get worse. But what would they do about it? Would they just sit there and let it happen? Or would they stand up for themselves and make sure Sarah knew she couldn't get away with treating them like this? As Maya thought about it, she realized something. It wasn't just about them. It was about everyone who had ever been judged or underestimated. It was about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. And little did Sarah know, Maya and Tyrone were about to do something that would change everything. Something no one, not even Sarah, would see coming. What would you do if someone treated you like you didn't belong? Keep watching, because just 3 minutes into this flight, everything changed for everyone. Maya and Tyrone had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. They'd worked hard and saved up for this moment, finally getting a chance to relax and enjoy a vacation. After a long and busy few months, they had been dreaming of the time they'd spend in Los Angeles, a city full of sunshine and excitement. They boarded the plane early, eager to get to their destination, find their seats, and get comfortable. The flight wasn't very long, so they were happy to just sit back and enjoy the ride. The plane was quiet as they settled into their seats. Maya, as always, was quick to grab the window seat. She loved looking out the window and watching the world shrink as the plane took off. Tyrone, her boyfriend, sat next to her. He was a little taller than Maya, and he liked to stretch out and relax on flights, especially when he could look out the window too. They smiled at each other, excited about the trip ahead as the other passengers slowly trickled into their seats. Everything seemed normal at first. The flight attendants made their way down the aisle, handing out snacks, drinks, and helping people settle in. Maya sipped her water, and Tyrone pulled out his tablet to check some things for work. It was peaceful. They were both looking forward to relaxing. But there was something in the air. Something wasn't right. Maya couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she could feel a kind of tension building up. She looked around the cabin, noticing how some passengers were looking at them, especially the flight attendants who were walking up and down the aisle. Maya shook off the feeling, telling herself she was probably just being paranoid. She settled back into her seat, resting her head against the headrest, and let her mind wander to the vacation ahead. It didn't take long for the tension to become clear. "Excuse me, sir," a voice suddenly broke into their peaceful moment. It was a flight attendant named Sarah, walking down the aisle. She was tall, with brown hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She was wearing the usual flight attendant uniform, blue with white accents, looking sharp and professional. But there was something about her tone that made Maya and Tyrone both pause. Sarah wasn't rude, but she wasn't friendly either. She spoke as if she already knew everything about them, even though she hadn't said more than 2 words. "Could you move your bag, please?" Sarah asked. Her voice was firm, but not unkind. The words themselves were simple, but the way she spoke them made Tyrone feel uncomfortable. He was surprised, unsure why she was speaking to him this way. Tyrone was caught off guard. He had only just settled into his seat, and he hadn't even noticed his bag was in the way. But he didn't want to make a scene, so he smiled politely and said, "Sure, no problem." He started to shift the bag from the aisle, thinking that would be the end of it. But before he could even finish, Sarah's eyes moved past him, almost like he wasn't even there. She focused on Maya, who had been sitting quietly by the window, reading a book. Maya hadn't been paying much attention to Sarah until now, but she couldn't ignore it when Sarah spoke directly to her. "Ma'am, I need you to store that bag properly," Sarah snapped. Her voice was sharper now, and it caught Maya off guard. Maya blinked, surprised by how harsh the tone sounded. She didn't understand why Sarah was being so strict when her bag wasn't blocking anyone's path. Maya wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't want to start an argument, but at the same time, she couldn't just ignore it. "I thought it was fine there," Maya said, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was already moving on, her expression hardening. "You think just because you're in first class that rules don't apply?" she said, her voice filled with judgment. The words stung Maya's ears, and she felt her heart drop. The sharpness of Sarah's tone made it clear that she was making an assumption about them, something that wasn't true. Maya looked at Tyrone, her eyes wide with surprise. The way Sarah had spoken to them, it wasn't just about the bag. There was something more to it. She could feel it deep in her chest. But before she could think more about it, Sarah had already turned away. She walked down the aisle without another word, as if the conversation had never happened. Tyrone looked at Maya, his brow furrowed. He could see the shock on her face, but he also saw something else. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, a kind of resilience that he knew all too well. Maya wasn't the kind of person to get upset easily, and Tyrone could see that she was already processing what had just happened. Maya's hand instinctively went to her bag, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she placed her hand on her lap, her fingers clenched tightly. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising frustration she felt. "What was that about?" Tyrone whispered, his voice low but full of confusion. Maya didn't immediately answer. She turned her eyes toward the window, pretending to look outside, but her mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah hadn't just asked them to move a bag. No, Sarah had treated them differently, like they didn't belong in the seat they were sitting in. It wasn't the first time Maya had experienced something like this, but it still stung. Tyrone was silent for a moment. He could see how this was affecting Maya, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. He was upset too, but he didn't want to make a big deal out of it. He knew Maya would want to handle this in her own way, but the injustice of the situation bothered him too much to stay quiet. He glanced around the cabin, trying to figure out if anyone else had noticed the exchange. He didn't see anyone staring at them, but he did notice a few people glancing their way. He knew they must have heard the way Sarah spoke to them. The awkwardness in the air was thick now, and Tyrone couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "I don't understand," Tyrone said quietly. "Why did she treat us like that?" Maya sighed and finally turned to face him. "I don't know," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I think she made an assumption about us. Like she thought we didn't belong in first class, just because of how we look." Tyrone's eyes widened as the realization hit him. "You think she thought we didn't belong here?" Maya nodded slowly, her gaze shifting to the front of the plane. "I don't know what else it could be," she said. "I've had this happen before, you know. People looking at me like I'm not supposed to be somewhere, just because of the color of my skin. I thought it might be different on this flight, but it feels like nothing has changed." Tyrone frowned, his mind racing. He didn't know how to respond. He had never really been on the receiving end of judgment like Maya had. It was hard for him to understand, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. He wanted to protect her from all the pain she had felt in the past, but he knew that wasn't always possible. He reached over and gently took her hand in his. "I'm sorry, Maya," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You shouldn't have to deal with that." "No one should." Maya squeezed his hand, a small smile appearing on her face. "I know, but this is just something I have to deal with." It's been happening my whole life." They sat in silence for a few moments, both lost in their thoughts. The peacefulness of the flight had been replaced by a sense of discomfort. Maya couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's words, and she could tell that Tyrone was feeling the same way. The tension in the cabin was still there, lingering like a shadow over them. Then, the flight attendants began their rounds again. As Sarah passed by their row, she didn't make eye contact with them. She just moved on, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. But Maya couldn't let it go. She couldn't just sit there and act like everything was fine. Tyrone looked at her, sensing the change in her. Maya turned to him, her eyes filled with determination. "I can't just let this slide," she said quietly. "I need to say something. People shouldn't be treated this way, no matter who they are or where they come from." Tyrone nodded. He knew his girlfriend well. When Maya made up her mind, there was no changing it. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he was ready to support her. And just like that, the stage was set. Maya and Tyrone knew that this flight wasn't going to be just another trip. It was going to be a moment that would change everything. They didn't know how, but they knew they weren't going to let it go. Not this time. And as the plane soared through the sky, they both knew something important was about to unfold. The conflict wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. The plane continued to hum steadily through the sky, its engines buzzing like a soft lullaby. Maya and Tyrone were both lost in their thoughts, their minds racing as they sat side by side. The tension from earlier still hung in the air, and neither of them could completely relax. Maya kept replaying the encounter with Sarah over and over in her mind. The way Sarah had spoken to her, the sharp tone, the dismissiveness, the way she'd looked right past Tyrone as if he didn't even exist, it all felt wrong. At first, Maya tried to shake it off. She had been on many flights before, and this was just one moment in a sea of long travel days. She had dealt with people making assumptions about her before. It was nothing new, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. Every time it happened, it hurt just as much. But this time, something about it felt different. There was something about Sarah's attitude that Maya couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the bag. It was about something deeper. It felt personal. Tyrone, on the other hand, was trying his best to stay calm. He wasn't the type of person to get worked up easily, but he could see how this situation was affecting Maya. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the way she was pulling away from the world around her, the way her shoulders were tense, as if she were bracing for something else to happen. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Maya had been dealing with unfair treatment for a long time, and it wasn't something that could just be fixed with a few kind words. He understood that, but still, he couldn't shake the feeling of anger building up inside him. As the flight went on, Sarah made her rounds again. She moved quickly up and down the aisle, her movements sharp and efficient. But there was something about her body language that made Maya uneasy. Every time she passed their row, her eyes would linger on them, just for a moment longer than necessary. Maya could feel the weight of her gaze, as if Sarah was silently judging them without saying a word. Tyrone noticed it too. He could see the way Sarah would glance at them, then quickly look away, almost as if she was avoiding them. He didn't know what was going on, but something felt off. He couldn't help but wonder if they were being singled out. It wasn't a great feeling, and it made him even more frustrated. "I don't like this," Tyrone muttered under his breath. "I don't like the way she keeps looking at us." Maya glanced over at him, her brow furrowed in concern. "I know," she whispered. "It's like she's treating us like we don't belong here, like we don't even deserve to be on this flight." Tyrone nodded, his fists clenching in frustration. He hated that Maya was feeling this way, and he hated that there wasn't much he could do to change it. He wanted to say something, to speak up and defend her, but he didn't want to make things worse. He knew how easily a situation like this could escalate, and he didn't want to cause a scene. But then something happened that made everything even more uncomfortable. Maya had been watching Sarah as she walked past their row once again, but this time, Maya noticed something different. Sarah was talking to another flight attendant, a man who looked a little older, with gray hair and glasses. Maya wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help overhearing their conversation. Sarah leaned in close to the other flight attendant, her voice low and almost conspiratorial. Maya's heart skipped a beat when she heard Sarah mention their row. "Did you see them?" Sarah asked in a hushed tone. "The couple in first class. I don't know how they even got on this flight." Maya's ears buzzed with surprise. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sarah wasn't just talking about them like they were a problem. She was talking about them like they were some kind of mistake. It was as if their presence on the plane was a mystery to be solved. Maya felt a knot form in her stomach as she processed Sarah's words. She glanced over at Tyrone, who was staring straight ahead, clearly unaware of what had just been said. "Maya," Tyrone whispered suddenly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't think she's just looking at us like we're trouble. There's something else going on here." Maya looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyrone leaned closer to her, lowering his voice even further. "I just heard what she said to that other flight attendant. She was whispering about us. It's like she doesn't think we belong here, like we're out of place." Maya's stomach dropped. She felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. This wasn't just about a bag. It wasn't just about an innocent mistake or a misunderstanding. There was something deeper going on, something that wasn't about her at all. It was about who they were, how they looked, and the assumptions Sarah had made about them without even knowing them. Maya's thoughts began to race. Was it because they were a black couple sitting in first class? Was Sarah uncomfortable seeing them in that seat, assuming that they didn't deserve it? Maya had experienced racism in many forms before, but this felt different. This felt more deliberate, like Sarah was judging them before they even had a chance to speak. Tyrone's eyes were full of concern as he looked at Maya. He could see the confusion and hurt on her face. "Maya," he said softly, "I don't know what's going on, but I know this doesn't feel right. We need to be careful how we handle this." Maya nodded, her thoughts spinning. She wasn't sure what to do. She wanted to say something, to confront Sarah about what had happened, but she didn't want to make things worse. She didn't want to cause a scene on the plane. But at the same time, she couldn't just sit there and let Sarah get away with this. Maya had spent her entire life learning to navigate situations like this. She had dealt with unfair treatment before in different forms. But this time, something was different. She didn't want to let this moment slip away without taking action. If she didn't speak up now, would it only get worse? Would Sarah think it was okay to treat them like this on every flight they took? As the minutes ticked by, Maya's decision became clearer. She couldn't stay silent. She needed to stand up for herself and for Tyrone. It wasn't just about the treatment they had received on this flight. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up against the unfairness that people of color often faced, especially in spaces where they were expected to be invisible or lesser than others. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. This was about something much larger than that. Maya turned to Tyrone and squeezed his hand. "I'm going to say something," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not going to let her treat us this way." Tyrone looked at her, his eyes full of support. "Are you sure? I don't want you to get hurt, Maya. I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be." Maya smiled at him, her determination shining through. "I'm sure. I'm done staying quiet." With that, Maya stood up, her heart racing. She wasn't sure how Sarah would react, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this moment pass by without doing something. It was time for her to take control of the situation and show Sarah and everyone else on the plane that she and Tyrone were just as deserving of respect as anyone else. As Maya made her way down the aisle, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. She wasn't sure what they were thinking, but it didn't matter. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for herself, for Tyrone, and for anyone who had ever been made to feel small or invisible. And as she approached the front of the plane, where Sarah was standing, Maya knew that this was just the beginning. The conflict wasn't over. It was only just beginning to unfold. But Maya was ready. She was ready to stand up for herself and make sure that she and Tyrone were seen and heard, no matter what. And as she prepared to face Sarah, Maya took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. The plane suddenly jolted, a slight shake that was enough to make the passengers gasp. Some of them clutched their armrests, their eyes wide with surprise. But Maya? She was calm. Her gaze locked onto Sarah, the flight attendant who had been ignoring them for the past hour. Sarah's usual stern expression seemed a bit more tense now, her body stiff as she walked down the aisle, trying to maintain her professionalism. Maya could see it. Sarah was walking on eggshells, afraid of what might happen next. But Maya wasn't afraid anymore. Maya stood up quickly, her eyes scanning the rows of seats as she made her move. The slight turbulence might have made everyone uneasy, but for Maya, it was the final push she needed. She wasn't going to let Sarah pass by without saying something, without letting her know how hurtful her actions had been. "Excuse me," Maya said, her voice firm but calm, carrying a quiet confidence. There was no shaking in her words. This was a moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had the strength now, and it was time to use it. "Could we talk?" Sarah stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened in surprise, as if she hadn't expected to be addressed like that. Normally, people let flight attendants do their jobs without question. But Maya wasn't just anyone. She was tired of letting people like Sarah walk all over her, tired of letting her feel invisible. She wasn't just going to sit quietly any longer. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," Sarah said, trying to sound professional, but there was an edge to her voice, like she was defensive. She clearly didn't want to engage with Maya, but Maya wasn't backing down. "No," Maya replied, her voice quiet but piercing. "It's not about that." Sarah blinked, clearly caught off guard. She had been expecting a simple question, maybe a request for a drink or a blanket, but this was different. This was something that required more than just the usual polite response. "It's about how you treated us," Maya continued, her gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "You made assumptions before you even spoke to us. You assumed that we didn't belong here, and you treated us like we were out of place." Maya's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire aisle seemed to hold its breath. It was as if everyone on the plane was suddenly aware of the tension in the air, the building conflict that had been simmering quietly ever since they boarded. But this wasn't just a quiet moment. It was a turning point. It was the moment Maya had been waiting for. This was her chance to speak up and let Sarah know exactly how wrong she had been. Sarah's face turned red, and for a moment, she was silent. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't thought that Maya would stand up to her like this. She hadn't thought that Maya would have the courage to say something, especially not in front of so many people. Maya didn't stop. "And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice unwavering. She wasn't shouting or raising her voice, but there was something powerful in the way she spoke. Every word she said seemed to hit with the force of a wave, and Sarah couldn't seem to look away. She felt her face flush with embarrassment. Her actions were being exposed, and for the first time, she realized that what she had done wasn't just a small mistake. It was a problem. A big problem. The entire plane was silent now. The hum of the engines seemed to fade, and for a brief moment, the noise of the flight attendants and passengers talking seemed to disappear. All eyes were on them. All eyes were on Maya, the quiet woman who had been overlooked, the one who had been treated unfairly. She was finally standing up for herself, and everyone could see it. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. Tyrone, who had been sitting silently beside Maya, now stood up too. His presence was like a solid rock beside her, steady and strong. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his fingers giving her a reassuring squeeze. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. He wasn't going to let her carry the weight of this moment by herself. "We're not who you think we are, Sarah," Tyrone said, his voice calm and strong. His words had a quiet strength, like a steady drumbeat that demanded attention. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes wide with confusion. "And in the next 3 minutes, everything is about to change," Tyrone added, his voice carrying with the kind of confidence that made everyone listen. His words weren't just for Sarah, they were for the whole plane. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been judged, for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. His words were a promise, a declaration that something was about to shift. Something big. Sarah's eyes darted back and forth between Maya and Tyrone, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected them to stand up to her like this. She had expected them to stay quiet, to be passive, to let her get away with her assumptions. But they weren't doing that. They were challenging her. And in that moment, she realized something that she hadn't wanted to admit. She was wrong. Everything she had assumed about them was wrong. And now, she was about to find out just how wrong she had been. Maya and Tyrone weren't just passengers on this plane. They weren't just a couple sitting in first class. They were people who had been underestimated, overlooked, and judged based on the way they looked. But in that moment, they were more than that. They were standing up for themselves, standing up for what was right. They were demanding respect, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Sarah, for the first time, seemed unsure of herself. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, a way to salvage the situation, but there was no easy way out. She couldn't just pretend this didn't happen. She couldn't pretend that Maya's words didn't cut deep. Maya's voice had spoken the truth, and it was a truth that Sarah had to face. 3 minutes, Tyrone repeated, his words hanging in the air. He wasn't just talking about time. He was talking about everything that had led up to this moment. The years of people being overlooked, the years of being judged before they were even given a chance. This was the moment when everything would change. And Sarah, whether she realized it or not, was going to be part of that change. The tension in the air was palpable. The passengers, who had been watching quietly, were now all tuned in, their eyes on Maya and Tyrone. This was no longer just a conversation between two people. This was something bigger. This was about fairness. This was about respect. And most of all, this was about standing up for what's right. The next few minutes would change everything. The tension in the air was thick. Sarah stood there, her face flushed and her hands trembling slightly. She had been confronted, and for the first time, she didn't have a quick answer. The usual confidence that she carried with her was gone, replaced by confusion and a growing sense of guilt. Maya's calm, firm words had shaken her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the passengers watching them. It was the fact that she knew Maya and Tyrone were right. She had judged them, assumed things about them, and treated them unfairly. She knew it, but she didn't know how to fix it. As Sarah opened her mouth to say something, anything, her words faltered. That's when the seatbelt sign above their heads flickered on. It was a small moment, but it added another layer of anticipation to the already charged atmosphere. The lights above blinked on, signaling that they were about to enter a brief period of calm as the flight prepared to make an announcement. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a brief announcement." The words echoed through the cabin, but it wasn't the announcement that had Maya's attention. It was what happened next. The moment the captain finished, Maya and Tyrone exchanged a quiet glance, understanding each other without needing to speak. They had been waiting for this moment to take shape, and now it was time for the final act. Maya could feel the change in the air, like the calm before a storm, but it wasn't a storm of anger or frustration. It was something more powerful. It was the storm of truth and fairness. Maya looked directly at Sarah again, but this time her voice softened. There was no more heat in her words. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point anymore. It was about justice. It was about showing Sarah the reality of what had happened. "We didn't come here to fight, Sarah," Maya said, her voice calm and steady, carrying no trace of bitterness or anger. It was the kind of voice that demanded attention, but not because it was loud or harsh. It was the kind of voice that made people listen because it spoke with the weight of truth. "But we also won't stand by when people like you try to put us down." The words hung in the air for a moment, but the passengers on the plane seemed to feel the shift as well. It wasn't just about Sarah's behavior anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. But then, just as Sarah opened her mouth to respond, something unexpected happened. The doors to the cockpit suddenly opened, and a tall figure stepped into view. It was the head flight attendant, but she wasn't just any head flight attendant. She was someone whom Maya recognized immediately. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw her old mentor, the person who had taught her everything she knew about aviation. This wasn't just a regular flight attendant coming to do her job. This was someone who knew Maya well, someone who knew her history, her work ethic, and her values. The mentor stepped forward, her eyes sharp and focused. She had a presence that commanded respect without needing to say much at all. Her expression softened when she saw Maya, and she immediately turned her attention to Sarah. "Is everything okay here, Sarah?" the mentor asked, her voice low but steady. The question was simple, but there was no mistaking the seriousness behind it. Sarah's face drained of color. For a moment, she looked like she might faint, her hands clasped together in nervous tension. She hadn't expected anyone else to intervene. She certainly hadn't expected Maya's mentor, someone with years of experience, to step in. "Yes, just a misunderstanding," Sarah mumbled, her voice shaking slightly. She was trying to keep her composure, but it was clear that she was no longer in control of the situation. Her eyes darted nervously between Maya and Tyrone, as if she were trying to figure out how to escape the conversation without making things worse. But the reality was that it was too late. The damage had been done, and now she was being held accountable. The mentor didn't buy Sarah's explanation. She raised an eyebrow and gave a small nod. "Perhaps, Sarah, it's time for you to take a break. Let's have a chat, shall we?" she said in a voice that left no room for argument. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. Sarah could either leave the situation calmly or risk making it worse. The mentor's words hit Sarah like a wave. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just nodded, her face still pale. Sarah turned and walked down the aisle with the mentor, her shoulders slumped in defeat. As she passed by, the eyes of the passengers followed her. No one spoke, but everyone understood what had just happened. They had witnessed something important, something that would stick with them long after the flight was over. And then just like that, it was over. Sarah had been escorted away, and the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. The weight of the tension that had filled the air seemed to disappear. The passengers who had been watching the exchange now looked at Maya and Tyrone with something new: respect. They weren't just passengers on a plane anymore. They were people who had stood up for themselves in a difficult situation. They had stood up for what was right, and it was clear that they had earned something more than just a quiet seat in first class. They had earned the admiration of everyone around them. Maya turned to Tyrone, her eyes still focused on the aisle where Sarah had been taken away. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, but it wasn't just because of the outcome. It was because they had made a difference. They had made sure that Sarah understood the consequences of her actions. They had made sure that no one would walk over them again. Tyrone smiled at her, his face filled with pride. "You did great," he said softly, his hand resting on her shoulder. Maya smiled back, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of quiet confidence. "We did great," she replied. "This was about more than just us." The passengers around them began to murmur, and slowly, the flight attendants returned to their duties, the plane beginning to feel more like the peaceful, normal flight it had been before. But for Maya and Tyrone, the journey had just become something more. They hadn't just traveled from one place to another. They had shown that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As the plane continued on its way, the mood in the cabin lightened. The crew worked with more ease, the passengers settled back in their seats, and everything felt, once again, calm. But Maya and Tyrone knew that they had just made a small but important change in the world, one that started with them, but would ripple out to everyone around them. They had faced a challenge, stood their ground, and in doing so, they had not only changed Sarah's perspective, but had also inspired others to do the same. The flight would end eventually, but this moment would stay with them forever. And as the plane soared through the skies, Maya and Tyrone could both feel it. The quiet but undeniable power of standing up for yourself and the change that it can bring. As the plane cruised smoothly through the skies, Maya and Tyrone settled back into their seats. The hum of the engines and the gentle vibration of the plane seemed to create a peaceful atmosphere. The excitement from their earlier confrontation had faded, but the calm that replaced it was even more powerful. They had done what they needed to do, and now they could simply relax. They had stood up for themselves, not with loud words or angry gestures, but with quiet confidence and the strength of their beliefs. They had proven that when you stand up for what is right, you don't always need to raise your voice. Sometimes, the most important actions don't come from shouting, but from speaking your truth with calm and conviction. Sometimes, standing up for yourself simply requires clarity, courage, and grace. Maya leaned back in her seat, looking out of the window at the clouds below. Her mind wandered, but her heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. The weight of the situation, the tension that had once filled the air, seemed to evaporate as she realized just how much they had accomplished. In that one moment, she and Tyrone had shown everyone around them that it wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It wasn't about creating chaos or forcing people to listen. It was about standing tall, even when the world tried to push you down. Tyrone sat beside her, his hand gently resting on her arm. He didn't say anything at first, but Maya could feel the pride in his touch. They both knew that they had just done something important, something that went far beyond a simple argument with a flight attendant. They had made a statement that went straight to the heart of what it means to be human. It's not about how you look, where you're from, or what others assume about you. It's about who you are on the inside and the strength you find when you stand up for yourself. After a few moments of silence, Maya turned to Tyrone, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. "I'm glad we did that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyrone smiled, his eyes warm. "So am I. But I think what matters most is that we showed everyone around us that we don't have to take disrespect. And we didn't need to get angry to do it." Maya nodded, her thoughts lingering on their words. It was true. They hadn't let anger drive their actions. They hadn't shouted or argued. They hadn't tried to win the situation. Instead, they had simply stood up for what they believed was right. And in doing so, they had changed the course of the entire flight. Maya thought about Sarah. She wondered how the flight attendant was feeling now. Had she learned something? Would she change how she treated people in the future? Maya didn't know, but she hoped so. Because the truth was, when you treat someone unfairly, you don't always realize the weight of your actions. But when someone stands up to you, when they show you that they won't be treated that way, it forces you to look at things differently. Sarah would have to think about what had happened. She would have to ask herself why she had treated Maya and Tyrone that way in the first place. And maybe, just maybe, she would learn something valuable from it. In the end, Maya realized that sometimes the most important lessons come when you least expect them. Standing up for yourself might not always change the world right away, but it can change one person's perspective, and that could make all the difference. The rest of the flight passed by without incident. People talked softly to one another, the sounds of the plane a comforting background to the quiet hum of conversation. Maya and Tyrone didn't feel the need to explain what had happened. They didn't need to tell anyone else what had transpired. They knew, and the people around them, who had quietly witnessed the exchange, would remember it too. They had seen something important happen. They had seen two people stand up for themselves, not with anger or violence, but with strength and dignity. As they neared their destination, the plane began to descend, and the familiar sound of the landing gear being lowered filled the cabin. Maya glanced at Tyrone again, and this time she saw a different look in his eyes. It was a look of quiet pride, not just for what they had done, but for the way they had done it. They hadn't needed to shout. They hadn't needed to demand attention. They had simply been themselves, and that had been enough. It was a feeling that Maya would carry with her long after the plane landed. She would remember this flight, not for the turbulence or the tension that had filled the air at the start, but for the calm that followed. For the way she and Tyrone had stood up for what was right, not because they had to, but because they knew they could. The plane touched down gently, and the passengers began to gather their things. Maya and Tyrone stood up and collected their bags, making their way toward the exit. As they walked down the aisle, they received smiles and nods from the people around them. Some of the passengers even gave them a quiet thumbs up or a soft word of encouragement. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot to Maya. It told her that their actions hadn't gone unnoticed, that in some small way they had made a difference. Maya glanced back at the flight attendants who were now preparing to help passengers disembark. Sarah wasn't anywhere to be seen. Perhaps she was in the back speaking with her mentor, or maybe she was reflecting on the events of the flight. Maya didn't know, and for the moment, she didn't need to. What mattered was that they had shown her, and everyone else, that standing up for what's right didn't require anger. It required courage. It required strength. And, most importantly, it required grace. As they stepped off the plane and into the terminal, Maya took a deep breath, feeling the cool air on her face. She and Tyrone had earned this moment, and she knew that it would stay with her for a long time. Ready for the next adventure? Tyrone asked, his smile wide. Maya laughed softly, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. Definitely, she said, but I think we've already had an adventure today. They walked through the terminal side by side, knowing that this moment, this small act of standing up for what was right, would stay with them forever. And that was something no one could take away. Because the truth is, the quietest people are often the ones who are hardest to overlook, and they're the ones who change everything. And as Maya and Tyrone continued their journey, they knew that they had done just that. They had changed something. They had changed the way people saw them, and more importantly, they had changed the way people would treat others in the future. And that, Maya realized, was the most powerful kind of change. The kind that starts with one small action, but ripples out into the world, creating a wave of understanding and respect that could never be undone.